It's great to be back with you again today. And I got a couple requests from you for topics that you'd like me to discuss. And so I will, of course, do what you ask. And I'm going to remind you very briefly that we are in the middle of a lecture series. And so I will return to the themes in that lecture series as we finish with the discussion of the topics you're interested in. But let's start with the topics that you're interested in. And so the lecture series, of course, is on race and justice in America in the 21st century. And I do think, we just got an outcome with Breonna Taylor grand jury not convicting police officers. And I'll just say very quickly, I mean, I believe most of you are familiar with the fact scenario here, which is that Breonna Taylor is a young woman in Louisville, Kentucky, who had been dating someone who was wanted by the police, was no longer dating him, but the police used her address, got what's called a no-knock warrant, which allowed them to break down her door without announcing that they were police. Her boyfriend fired shots at the police. The police returned fire, and because in part the boyfriend fired because he didn't know who had entered his home or what these men with flashlights and guns represented. The police then fired multiple shots, and Breonna Taylor was in fact killed, right? And so I would say two things about this, and again, in the context of a lecture series on race and justice in America, this may be the correct decision by the grand jury in applying the law, which is to say, when police officers are under fire, it's understandable that they would return fire, right? And so the question is whether they were indiscriminate or reckless in the way in which they did, and they did find one officer was in fact reckless, and so he's being charged with reckless endangerment, but that has to do with the fact that he basically shot at a neighboring apartment, not that he fired the shots that killed Breonna Taylor. Now, having said that, I also want to say, I'm not sure that the grand jury was wrong in not indicting the officers. It's obviously a tragedy. It's obviously very upsetting that an innocent young woman who, by all accounts, was leading a good life, she was an EMT helping people during the pandemic, right? That this is an awful thing to have happened, but that it may not be a criminal act by the police. Having said all of that, I also think it's completely understandable in ways that we've been describing that the sense that the police generally bring disproportionate use of force, including lethal force, they end up killing disproportionately many more African Americans, about 3 times as many, that often this is unjustified, and that often the police are not accountable for their use of force and violence and killing, as well as their disproportionate profiling of African Americans. That is to say, this occurs in the context of a kind of injustice where many African Americans, I think, justifiably view the police as akin to an occupying force in their community. And at the same time, the police justifiably understand African Americans as quite hostile to them. And so we talked a little bit about the techniques that work. One of them is a de-escalation technique, right? To train the police to bring the tension level, the animosity down, to treat the person they're interacting with the kind of respect that puts them better at ease, which makes it less likely that there's going to be a violent interaction that might escalate, right? And so I do think, in a sense, we need to be thinking about de-escalation between the police and African Americans as a society as a whole. What is it that we can do to better improve police community relations, and that does involve systematic police reform. So even if the police officers in this particular case don't deserve to be indicted, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the discussion. There's much more to be talked about. Now, having said all of that, all that is to say that the topic for the lecture series we're in the middle of is very much in the news and may in fact have an impact on the electoral outcomes. Donald Trump is trying very hard to make this a campaign about law and order. The polling data seems to indicate that he's not being very successful, but that he's pointing to things like the protests in Kentucky 2 nights ago that did lead to 2 police officers being shot as a way of trying to motivate his base and increase his appeal with suburban voters, especially suburban white women. So having said all that, one of the things I'm told you want me to talk about is the presidential election, and I'm happy to do that. And obviously we are now in the home stretch. We are less than 6 weeks from election day. And so the first thing I want to talk with you about is what's happening in the presidential election. And as you know, in ways I will explain in a few minutes, I like using models for the outcome of the election, which is different from using polling data. Obviously, Joe Biden does not have a poll lead of 77 to 23%. But when we look at what his polling lead is, which is about 7% nationally, and break it down state by state, and then look at how that translates into votes in the Electoral College. And I promise I'll explain more of this in just a moment. What this indicates is that it looks like Biden has about a 3 in 4 chance of winning the election. Now, please recognize that if you're a betting person, a lot of time you would take the 1 in 4 long shot, right? That's not a terrible long shot for Donald Trump, and dynamics can change. We have major new developments, especially the death of Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the fact that it appears that the Senate will receive a nomination to replace her from Donald Trump, perhaps by Saturday, and that the Senate will move to very rapidly consider the nomination from the president. It's not clear whether they will try to actually conclude the nominating hearings before the election. That would be a very fast, very tight schedule, or if they will try to do it in the lame duck session after the election has been concluded. But it does appear that the Senate now has the numbers, Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party in the Senate, to confirm a replacement for Ginsburg. And so Ginsburg, one of the leaders of the left coalition, the justices that have been supported or appointed by Democrats and that tend to vote on the more liberal or progressive side of the court, will be replaced by a right-wing justice. It seems clear that Donald Trump will appoint someone who is very conservative, and that the result will be that the composition of the court will be dramatically altered, right? That the conservatives will have a almost lock on a 5-4 majority, even if Justice Roberts, who himself is quite conservative, but has occasionally voted with the more liberal justices, if he sometimes votes with the liberal justices, it still will not be enough to tilt the court. It will take another conservative justice, 2 conservative justices siding with the liberals to change the court if this succeeds. And this is roiling the campaign. It seems clear in terms of the polls that the majority of Americans do not support a rapid appointment to the Supreme Court, that they favor that person who wins the election in November being able to make that appointment, which could be Donald Trump, right? He has a 1 in 4 chance of winning the election, but it also could very well be Joe Biden, in which case you would have a very different appointment to the court. Having said all of that, for those of you who are paying attention, this is very similar to what I showed you a few weeks ago, right? I shouldn't say paying attention. I trust that you're paying attention. But for those of you who remember, this is almost exactly what it was several weeks ago. And so as of today, we don't see the fact that there's likely to be a unpopular Supreme Court appointment made by Donald Trump and confirmed by the Senate, changing the electoral prospects of either Biden or Trump. Now, I believe the calculus on Donald Trump's part is that it may ultimately redound to his favor. And I believe there are two reasons he thinks this. The first has to do with the fact that he actually does well when he is the center of a controversy that is a polarizing political controversy, right? And so 60% of Americans don't favor him making a new appointment to the court, but that means that 30 to 40% do approve. And those 30 to 40% are his core supporters. And when he gets their support, he has a fighting chance for winning re-election. So it may mobilize them. And at the same time, it seems likely to change the topic away from the handling of the coronavirus pandemic in this country, for which he is roundly blamed for mismanagement, as well as its economic consequences. So there is an electoral scenario in which rushing a Supreme Court appointment actually benefits Donald Trump relative to the current dynamic, which is stably favoring Joe Biden. Now, as you can see, this is the forecast of the popular vote, not the Electoral College vote. And I will get into this in a few minutes, but I want you to see that Joe Biden has a sizable advantage over Donald Trump in the popular vote margin, roughly 7%, right? And that advantage has been quite stable for a long time. Now, one would think 7% advantage in the polls, he should have a very good chance of winning the election. That's a landslide, really, right? The way in which politics has gone in this country for a long time, it's been a very long time since a candidate has won a 7% margin. When Barack Obama won a 3% margin over John McCain, that was considered to be a fairly robust victory. 7% would be a very robust victory. But what matters is not how Joe Biden does in the popular vote. What matters is how he does at the state by state level. And I know this graph is a little difficult to disentangle, but I want to spend a minute or two on it to explain it. Now, I've shown it to you before, but I want to go a little bit more into the details. Let's start with California, right? California has nearly 40 million voters in it, right? It is by far and away the most populous state in the country. It is also a very liberal state. And the result is that when 60% or more of the California electorate votes Democratic, it might be as much as 70%, that there might be 2 million people more voting for Joe Biden than for Donald Trump in California. But the truth of the matter is, if it were 1,000 people more voting for Joe Biden as opposed to 2 million more, the outcome would still be the same. Most states are winner take all with the Electoral College. That means if you win by one vote, you get all the Electoral College votes. Only Nebraska and Maine have gone over to a form of proportional representation, which means if one candidate wins one congressional district, another candidate wins another congressional district, they split the Electoral College votes for that state. That's not the way it works in California or Texas. For much of the last 30 years, California has been decisively liberal, Texas decisively conservative. They've kind of canceled each other out. And so there's been a rough alignment between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. But as we've seen in the beginning of this century, in the 2000 election, when George W. Bush won the Electoral College vote, but did not win the popular vote, that started to shift as both Texas and California have become more liberal, but Texas not sufficiently more liberal that the Democrats are going to win. Just that as opposed to it being a 1 million person margin for the Republican in Texas, which kind of starts to cancel out the 2 million margin in California, maybe the Republicans win Texas by only a few 100,000, and the Democrats win California by a couple million. You're beginning to see, I hope, why it is that the popular vote may go decisively to the Democrats, but the Electoral College vote may be much closer or even go the other way. So give me one moment and go ahead. I was hearing a comment. I couldn't tell who it was.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing we can do about it. That's the law.
There is, it's the Constitution, to be precise, right? And I'm not suggesting that there's anything we can do about it. One of the things that I was told you were curious about is the relationship between what's happening with the polls and what's happening with the Electoral College. And so that's what I'm trying to explain. But there is, to be clear, things we could be doing about it. And so it's very unlikely that we're going to eliminate the Electoral College. That would require a constitutional amendment, and obviously the Republicans are not in favor of that at the moment, and frankly, many Americans are not in favor of that in the moment. But as I've already said, Maine and Nebraska have gone over to proportional representation. What that means basically is that it's not the case that the person who wins that state gets all that state's Electoral College votes. As opposed to that, if the two candidates roughly split the state, they roughly split the Electoral College votes that that state gets. If we started to do that on a national basis, there's a much greater chance that there would be an alignment between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. And by the way, it wouldn't be a perfect alignment. Let me explain why. The way in which Electoral College votes are appropriated by the Constitution, they essentially reflect the overall congressional delegation of a state. Now, we know that the census is coming up and Congress, the House of Representatives, is apportioned roughly proportionate to population, right? So if your state has a big population, you have more members of the House. If you have a small population, you have fewer members of the House. But when it comes to the Senate, every state gets equal representation, 2 senators, right? As Patricia is pointing out, right? And so that means that the less populous states actually have more of an impact per person in the Electoral College than the more populous states do. And so in addition to what I was showing you a moment ago, which I'll go back to showing you now, which is that California may have a lot of people voting and voting primarily Democratic, whereas some of these other states may be much closer. So that skews the popular vote, in a sense, makes it fall out of alignment with the Electoral College vote. When you look at the states up here that are firmly in the Democratic camp, right? We've got Wyoming, West Virginia, Idaho, Oklahoma, North Dakota, Kentucky, South Dakota, Nebraska. What all of those states have in common is that they are very conservative and not very populous. They're relatively small states. But having said that, they get greater impact in the Electoral College because they have 2 senators in addition to their House of Representative delegates voting in the Electoral College. Whereas California, which has, right, about, I believe it is 60 times the population of Wyoming, it may be 70 times the population of Wyoming, only gets 2 senators, right? They're equal with regards to the senatorial representation. And so that gives these less populous, more conservative states more power in terms of the presidential election. So I think I heard a comment or a question. Go ahead. No?
No.
I thought I heard a male voice, which would mean it was probably Peter based on what I'm seeing. No? Okay, then I will keep going. And I want to show this in a little bit more detail now. And so this is a diagram that shows you if Biden wins the popular vote in a very close vote between 0 and 1 percentage points, right? He has about a 6% chance of winning the Electoral College. If he wins it between 1 and 2 points, he has about a 22% chance. If he wins it between 2 and 3 points, he has approaching a 50% chance. And please note, this is Hillary Clinton's margin. So what happened with Clinton was not that improbable, right? Which is to say that a Democrat wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College vote. It's actually quite likely to happen if the margin is only 2 to 3 points, right? That's around Barack Obama's margin in 2008. Just notice that, right? If the margin goes up to around 3 to 4 percentage points in the popular votes, Biden's chance of winning gets to be about 74%. If it goes up to 4 to 5 percentage point, it goes up to 90%. If it goes up to 5 to 6, it becomes 98, 6 to 7, 99. Now, please note, he's at about 7% in the popular vote right now. Based on the polls, that should give him a very good chance of winning the election. And I think that when I show you a model that says he's got about a 3/4 chance, there's certain factors that are discounting or dragging him down. That has to do with the fact that Donald Trump is an incumbent and incumbents have a certain advantage and other things in the dynamics of the race. Now, one more thing I think we should consider, and that's the possibility of error in the polls, right? And so these are 3 different ways of looking at the Electoral College outcome. If basically all the states that Biden is leading in today, he won, right? And if on the other hand, and I should say leading with a fairly comfortable margin, 3 percentage points or more, Joe Biden would win the presidential election if it were held today. And you know, these states are too close to call, but even if Trump won all of them, then he still wouldn't win. If basically all the states where Biden is ahead, not just by 3 percentage points or more, but ahead, he won, and all the states that Trump is ahead in he won, you can see it would be a fairly decisive Electoral College victory. But as we know, in 2016, the most recent presidential election, polls were off. Now, I want to be clear. The pollsters have taken into account some of what was responsible for the mistakes that they made in 2016, and they've tried to correct for those mistakes. That there are people who will vote for Trump but won't say to a pollster that they will vote for Trump, or there are people who will vote for Trump who are harder to reach by a poll than the people who will vote for Clinton or Biden are. So if the polls were off as much today as they were 4 years ago, Trump would have a narrow victory. But I have to say immediately, I don't think that it's likely that the polls are off by that far. All right, so that's what I wanted to show you about what's happening in the presidential election. Does anybody have any questions or any comments at this point? Is this making sense?
Makes sense.
So let me, oh, go ahead. Yes.
Maybe I'm getting to something else. However, do you agree that perhaps the Constitution has given the presidential people too much power with hardly any restrictions? Do you believe that at all?
So I'm smiling because I want to show you a book that I'm looking at right now, and they're actually two books related to each other by the same authors. This is the older of the two, and as you can see, the title is Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Our Democracy. And this is the newer one. This is on the Constitution, and it's called Relic: How Our Constitution Undermines Effective Government. These are by two very well-respected political science professors. One is a professor at the University of Chicago, one is a professor at Stanford, and their argument is that the president isn't powerful enough, that our 18th century Constitution was very suspicious of centralized political power, and as a result, made a very weak president, and that in a sense, our politics suffers from the weakness of the president. So I just want to point out that there's certainly no consensus on this. But having said that, I will also point out to you that there's a whole literature on what's called the imperial presidency in the 20th century, and that essentially in the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II, the expansion of the military, especially in the Cold War, and the expansion of national security agencies like the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, that the presidency acquired much greater power than it had had historically. So I think it's an interesting debate. I don't think that it is clearly the case that the president has too much power. Having said all of that, let me also say, and there's a controversy in the news this week, of course, with Donald Trump having said in successive interviews that he's not sure he would subscribe to or endorse a peaceful transition in power, right? Which is following on an article written in the Atlantic that there wouldn't be a peaceful transition. I'm going to mute for a second just while you get that phone call under control. And so in addition to that, he was then asked if he would respect the outcome of the election. And he also said he didn't know if he would respect the outcome of the election, right? Depends on the ballots, as he put it quite cryptically. And so one of the things that I think is perhaps leading to the question, is the president too powerful, or does the Constitution invest too much power in the office of the presidency, is the fact that while the Constitution vests certain powers in an office, clearly the president is the only national elected official in this country. His powers are extensive, right? And the powers are not only the powers invested in the office by the Constitution, it's also, as Teddy Roosevelt put it, the bully pulpit, right? It's the power of being the person who the nation's political attention is constantly focused on. And in a sense, right, beginning with George Washington, who said, I will only serve 2 terms, and I hope that all subsequent holders of this office will only serve 2 terms, right? Eventually that resulted in a constitutional amendment. That a certain kind of restraint has also been characteristic of our presidents, not to abuse the power invested in the office. And there are exceptions to that. Andrew Jackson would be an exception. Richard Nixon would be an exception. And Donald Trump is clearly an exception. So I think we have to be careful not to think that the Constitution by itself can ever fully determine how the powers it vests in an office will be used. They can be abused, and we live in a democracy. You may remember when Benjamin Franklin was leaving the Constitutional Convention, right? The convention that gave us our Constitution. A woman was walking by Constitutional Hall in Philadelphia and asked him, did you give us a monarchy or a republic? And Benjamin Franklin replied, a republic if you can keep it, right? And so part of the question here is, do we reward or do we punish politicians who abuse the powers invested in their office? If we don't punish them, then the temptation to abuse those powers will be strong. All right, I'm unmuting everyone because I saw somebody had their hand raised. Give me one moment. Okay, everybody can speak now. Is there anybody else with the question at this juncture?
David.
Yes, go ahead, Peter.
It seems to me the press throws these loaded questions at Donald Trump because they know they're going to get a headline. And I'm not. It just. And of course, Donald Trump shoots his mouth off all day long, and we know that. So it seems to me they go to him to get more ridiculous statements from him. That's all I have.
Yeah, and this is a two-way street. And on the one hand, probably the press has never asked a president before, will you endorse a peaceful transition in power, right? The reason they asked this is because The Atlantic had written this article that said that there appears to be planning on the part of Trump's family and some people in the right-wing media sphere and perhaps some people in this administration to try to resist the outcome of the election if it doesn't go Trump's way. So there was a reason to ask this question. But I agree with you that there is a dynamic here, and this dynamic, frankly, is one that Trump plays into. And so you say, Peter, he shoots his mouth off all day. That's absolutely right. I mean, if we look at his Twitter account, there are days in which he's putting out 100 tweets, right? But having said that, it's also the case that I think Donald Trump thinks he benefits anytime, on the one hand, he can change the topic away from the coronavirus, right? Yeah. So in a sense, he's trying to move the narrative, and moving the narrative over to, will he resist power or resist a peaceful transition in power? is one way to do that. And frankly, that he knows that a lot of his supporters don't like the mainstream political culture. And so if Donald Trump pokes his finger in the eye of what liberals, et cetera, care about, the core supporters of his may in fact be cheered by that. And so there are reasons for Trump to be doing this. I think there are also reasons for us to be concerned. It's funny. I was teaching to my undergraduates yesterday an essay by David Hume, the great Scottish English political philosopher, right? He's Scottish, but he spent a lot of his time in England and wrote on, wrote a lot on British politics. And in this essay of political parties in general, he writes, and I'm going to quote him for a moment, as much as legislators and founders of states, right? So here we're talking about Ben Franklin, et cetera, ought to be honored and respected among men. And he's written a fair bit about this prior to this sentence. As much ought the founders of sects and fashions to be detested and hated, because the influence of faction is directly contrary to that of laws. And this is obviously 18th century prose. Let me explain for a moment that Hume is saying we should really worry about people who say it's more important to support my party than it is to support the laws of your society. And so while we know Trump shoots his mouth off and the press has an incentive because it gets their ratings up to encourage him to shoot his mouth off, I think we should also be worried about the impact on our political culture. And so one of the things that I say to my students regularly is that democratic institutions don't just function on their own, right? They require support. They need to take root. Those roots need to be deep and strong in the culture of a society such that the populace will, for instance, punish a politician who abuses the power invested in their office by the Constitution. If we don't do that, if the norms that support democracy lose their hold on us, then democracy becomes much more frail and fragile. Yeah. And so we should be not just saying, oh, it's Donald Trump running his mouth again, right? But saying, oh, we got to be careful. If 40% of the population cheers him when he does that, that means that the roots of democracy in this society have become much more fragile than they were. All right, so allow me to finish this part of the lecture, and I'm going to now transition very quickly to the Senate race. And the first thing I want you to notice, right? So basically, 1/3 of the seats in the Senate are decided every couple years, and so it's not the whole Senate that's up for grabs right now. It's about 35 seats. There's a couple special elections, which means it's a little higher than it normally is, and they indicate, based on the polling at a state-by-state level, that the Democrats are slightly favored to take control of the Senate, that their likely outcome, right, in 62 scenarios, the Democrats win control, and 38, the Republicans win control. And so there's a good chance that the Democrats will get at least 50 seats, a very good chance that they'll get 51 or 52 seats. I shouldn't say a very good chance. A very good chance that they'll get 50 seats. A decent chance that they'll get 51 or 52 seats if the polls are accurate and continue to hold. Now, having said that, you can see that whereas the presidential race has been very stable, it does appear that the Democrats are doing a little bit better in the Senate race than they were doing just at the beginning of the month, right? And so their chances have increased quite a bit over the course of September. And I do think one of the things we may be seeing here is that the fact that the Senate is rushing to approve a replacement for Justice Ginsburg is perhaps dragging down the chances of moderate Republicans or Republicans in states that are closely divided, like Maine and Colorado and Arizona, all of which have active senatorial races this year. And so we may see a change in the outcome of the Senate race, even if we don't see much of a change in the outcome of the presidential race because of what's happening with the Supreme Court. Now, I want to say one more thing here about the current politics, and I gather that you've also asked that I say a little something about what's happening in the Supreme Court. And so I've already said that the Electoral College has a bias to it, right? It gives greater power to the less populous, more conservative states. And the result is that the general tilt of the playing field is slightly in the Republicans' advantage in presidential elections. And I've pointed the reason for this, right, which is the disproportionate representation of the smaller states in the Senate, right? And as we know, the Constitution vests the advise and consent power in the Senate, right? What that means is that when a president appoints someone to the federal judiciary, the Senate has to approve that person. And that means that if the Senate tilts conservative, it's more difficult for Democrats to appoint people to the bench than it is for Republicans. And we have seen this, right? Which is to say, there were nearly 200 openings in the federal judiciary when Donald Trump assumed the presidency. Why were there so many openings? Because the Senate, under the Republicans' control, slowed down or refused to appoint the nominees that Barack Obama was putting forward. And so this was a deliberate strategy. Wait until Obama is out of office, hope that a Republican succeeds him, then there will be more of a chance for a more conservative judiciary. Generally speaking, the country is becoming more diverse and more liberal, right? That's a demographic change. It has to do with younger people forming more of the population, with Latinos and Asians forming a larger portion of the population. And those trends favor the Democrats. But they don't favor the Democrats in all those smaller, less populous states that tend to be more conservative and frankly whiter as well, more homogenous. And so part of what the strategy here is to try to use the federal judiciary as a check on the changes that are occurring in this country, so that if, as it appears is likely, Joe Biden wins the presidency and the Democrats win control of the Senate, they will not be able to get their full legislative agenda through. Now, I will talk to you more about this in subsequent elections. It's very speculative. I'm sorry, subsequent lectures. It's very speculative at the moment. But one of the questions is, Is this just? Is this fair? Is this democratic, right? Those are three separate questions, but they kind of go together. And does the Constitution, in a sense, serve as a hindrance on democracy right now? I am just going to point out to you, as I suggested, if I've got it right, the proportion of the population of California compared with that of Wyoming is about 70-1, right? In the founding, right, in 1789, the largest state was about 20 times larger than the smallest state, right? Comparing Virginia or New York to Delaware. And so our smaller states are much more powerful now relative to our larger states than they were at the founding. And it's not clear that the founders intended to give that much more power to states that had that little population, right? And so there's a question, is the Constitution still working the way it's supposed to work? It's also the case that the differences between the states seem to be less than they were in the founding. The single largest difference, that some of those states were slave-owning states and some of those states are not slave-owning states, has clearly gone away, right? But it's also the case that basically we have a lot of mobility in this society. People move from state to state. The average American moves 6 times in their life, and at least 1 or 2 of those moves is an interstate move. They don't just stay in the same state. Let me just have a quick show of hands. How many of you have lived in the same state your entire life? Okay, so it's actually interesting. It looks like it's around a third of you. That's high for the American population. I don't know how it breaks down by age, but if typically it would be more like 1 in 10 Americans stays in the same state their whole life, right? And that means that the states maybe should be less important in our politics than the nation. And again, the disproportionate representation in the Senate may undermine that. Having said all that, the only way we can change this is with a constitutional amendment. And the Constitution is particularly hostile to the idea of eliminating the equal representation of the states in the Senate. It requires every state to vote in favor of that, and that's got a snowflake's chance in hell, right? So what can the Democrats do if they want to try to level the playing field a little bit? And here I'll just mention 2 possibilities, maybe 3 possibilities. 2 of them have to do with the Supreme Court. One would be to change the composition of the Supreme Court, which would be to expand the Supreme Court or to pack the Supreme Court. I think many people will point out to you that that's kind of a vengeful move, right? Which is to say we're really angry that you didn't let Barack Obama appoint someone to the Supreme Court when he was in his last year, but you're letting Donald Trump do it when he's in his last month or 2. This is just unfair, and we're going to try to right it. But the problem with it is it destabilizes and maybe delegitimizes the institution. If the Republicans regain the presidency, what's to keep them from further expanding it? Another proposal that I think is perhaps a better proposal, but may be hard to do, would be to put a term limit or an age limit on the justices on the Supreme Court. You can only serve for 20 years, or you have to leave the court when you're 80 years old. And again, it seems clear if we compare the founding era with our current era. In the founding era, the people who were appointed to the court were older and served for less time. We are appointing younger people, and they serve for a lifetime, and people are living longer. And so it's now up to the point where the average tenure of recent appointees to the court is about 30 years, right? Ginsburg had been on the court for nearly 30 years. She was actually not exceptional in serving for that long. So maybe that would be something else to do. One other possibility, which I think is getting some attention and may get some more attention when, or if I should say, the Democrats regain power, would be expanding the number of states, offering Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico the opportunity to become states. And that takes a simple majority in the Senate, right? Assuming they eliminate the filibuster to prevent the Republicans from blocking those moves. And the result would be that 2 more Democratic states would join the Union and have representation in the Senate. And that might change some of the skew in the representation of the Senate. By the way, Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico are much larger than the smaller states in terms of their populations, right? So although D.C. would be a quote city state, right? It's not a large territory. Its population is relatively large, larger than Wyoming or Montana, comparable to Delaware and Rhode Island. All right, so I'll stop there. Any thoughts or questions about that? And I'm just trying to get you to think creatively and constitutionally about if this is a problem, either the Electoral College discrepancy from the popular vote or the bias in the power of the 2 parties to appoint to the Supreme Court. What kinds of avenues are available to us given our Constitution? Remember the title of the book, Relic. I don't think our Constitution is entirely a relic. I do think that it has some good provisions, and it has some provisions that made sense in the 18th century that need to be modified or reinterpreted in the 21st century for it to continue to work for us. Thoughts or questions about expanding statehood?
I think that'd be a good idea.
I didn't hear who that was. I saw Fran has her hand up. Why don't you go ahead, Fran, and then I'll come back to the other question.
Oh, just to throw a monkey wrench into your analysis. What would happen if we split California into 2 states? It's pretty big.
Oh yeah, and their proposals to split California into 6 or 7 states, you may be aware, right? It was on the ballot in California, I think 4 years ago, a proposal to split California into multiple states. I think there are 2 things, right? First of all, Californians would have to agree to this. And second of all, we would need a constitutional amendment probably, right? Because the current constitution of the states, so to be honest, let me be careful. I'm not sure we would need a constitutional amendment. It might be California could do this by its own internal legislature. Yeah, that's another possibility. And you then, of course, raise the possibility if California can do it internally, why shouldn't Wyoming? Why shouldn't Montana, right? And so you don't want to start an arms race that leads to silly or destructive outcomes. And of course, there's a question about whether or not if the Democrats offer statehood to Puerto Rico and DC, would the Republicans try to counter should they regain control? But it's less clear how the Republicans would counter. Another topic that's discussed here would be how can we depolarize the Supreme Court? So there are periods in the court's history where the party of the president appointing the justice has very little capacity to predict how the justice will vote. If you remember, Earl Warren, who presided over perhaps the most liberal period in the Supreme Court, was appointed by Eisenhower, right? And was appointed on the assumption that he would be a relatively conservative judge. And Earl Warren was of the opinion, having been a politician in California, that it's one thing when you're running for office to be elected by a party. It's another thing when your job is to interpret the Constitution of the country. That's not a partisan position, right? And on the other hand, it appears that we increasingly appoint our Supreme Court justices because we believe we understand their judicial philosophy or ideology, and we think it aligns with our partisan philosophy or ideology, right? And so could we have a less partisan Supreme Court, and wouldn't that be better for all of us? And maybe we need to stop nominating the justices to the Supreme Court just as a unilateral act of the president. Have a nonpartisan commission that the president relies on to nominate the justices to the Supreme Court. Again, I don't think that's very likely in the current political climate, but that would be another possible way around this. I believe someone in the atrium had a question. Is that right?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
My question is, Washington, D.C., what percentage of people who live and are counted in the population in Washington, D.C. work for the federal government or are employees of one of the branches? How many non-employees live in Washington, D.C.?
So I have no idea. I'm trying to look this up. So give me a second. And I'll see if I can get an answer for us real quick. I don't think it's going to be terribly high, but it's going to be higher than probably almost any other place in the country, right? And so here's an answer in terms of the workforce, right? Not in terms of the residency. So first of all, anybody got a guess as to how many people in the country work for the government? And by saying this, I'm going to have to include state and local in addition to the federal government.
No.
17%, right? So it's very high, actually. And having said that, one of the things I think we're worried about with this recession is that the number of people who work for local and state governments who may be losing their jobs if local and state budgets are undermined by the recession and lack of tax revenues could drag the whole economy down. So 17% of workers in the United States work for a government. 38% of the workforce in Washington, D.C. works for a government, right? That's not only the national government, but so obviously that's very high. But that doesn't mean that all of those people live in Washington, D.C., right? And I have lived in D.C. I don't know if anybody else here has lived in D.C., but an awful lot of the people who work for the government live in Virginia or Maryland, right, and commute to DC. And so it's not the case that everybody who works for the government lives in DC. Are you worried about having a state with too higher proportion of the population that works for the government?
Yes, I think that if you, but what I want to know is, I don't know, if too high a percentage of people in what would be the state of Washington, D.C. work for the government, mostly the federal government or their lobbyists or whatever they do. If that were the case, I don't know that I would favor making them a state. Puerto Rico is different. I think Puerto Rico should have that opportunity, but I don't know about Washington, D.C.
Yeah, very interesting, and I think it's an important consideration. Does it create perverse incentives if a significant portion of your population works for the government? Perverse incentives about funding government employees, etc. Having said that, you know, we have similar considerations in other places. A very high proportion of the population in South Dakota works for extractive industries that take petroleum products or other minerals out of the ground. A very high proportion of the population in Wyoming and Montana work in agriculture, right? And so states do have distinct economies, and that gives them distinct interests. And one of the things we rely on is the different states balancing each other out. And I suppose we'd have to rely on something similar with Washington, D.C. Any other questions or comments today?
Why do we feel that we have to balance the income of two states at a time? We did it with Hawaii and Alaska, but is it necessary for us to always consider, well, this one might be Republican, the other one Democrat? Is that why we are looking for two states?
Well, so this has been the norm in the past, and to be clear, it's not always been the norm, but it's been a 20th century, and in particular, a mid-20th century norm. It was an era of bipartisanship, right? And so the feeling was, if one state took advantage of expanding the states at the expense of another state, it would undermine the cooperation between the parties or the respect that the parties have for each other. The response at the current moment is that we don't have bipartisanship, we don't have respect, we don't have cooperation. And there's an article which I won't share with you the analysis of it today. Maybe I'll share it with you at another time. An article I was looking at recently by a political scientist at Bard University who says, Bard College, sorry, says basically what the health of American society requires right now is the domination of a single party. And he thinks that that party is the Democratic Party, right? And so he points out that the Conservative Party in Britain felt something similar in the 1980s and 1990s, and they did in fact dominate British politics until the Labour Party changed its course and on this view became more responsible, right? And that maybe what we need is Democratic Party domination in the next decade until the Republican Party becomes a more 21st century conservative party, better reconciled to the changing demographics of our society. I'm not endorsing that position, but that would be a reason then to not balance out Puerto Rico with another conservative state, but to say the Democrats are going to, while in power, pad their power so that the disproportionate representation of the less populous states doesn't bite them back in the next electoral cycle. All right, everybody, good talking with you today. And I do hope you'll continue to stay smart. Remember, the weather is changing, and as it changes, it may very well be that the level of contagion with the virus will come up. So please continue to be safe and smart. I will look forward to seeing all of you next week. Okay, take care, everybody. Thank you. Good. Take care. Bye-bye.
Well,